I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that all of us live our lives on stolen land. We meet tonight, no matter where we are across the continent, on the lands of First Nations peoples. I'm in the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and this was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to extend that respect to all First Nations people who might be joining us on the call tonight. And it's been said many times before, but as we talk about the kind of work that Refugee Legal does, we talk about sovereignty, who is and isn't welcome here in this country. First Nations justice has to be front of mind. Good evening and welcome to the 2021, not the annual Refugee Legal Annual Dinner, not the, I forget the title. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We're here together and that's the main thing. And I really appreciate you joining us and taking time on your Thursday night as the pandemic is hopefully winding up for us in Australia, still taking the time to join us online via Zoom. Maybe you're in another country as well. To all international guests, you're very welcome too. My name is Tom Ballard. I am your MC for this evening. It is my honor to do this. I think this is my 4th or 5th annual dinner for Refugee Legal, and it's my favorite corporate gig of the year. It's just a fantastic earner for me, and I keep coming back for the cash. Please give generously tonight, everyone. I'd appreciate it. I am all dressed up, even though we're at home. Bought this new shirt and my little Refugee Legal badge, and I'll be honest with you, tracksuit pants, because I figured you weren't going to see them, and I wanted to be comfortable. Hopefully you're comfortable too, whatever you're doing. Thank you very much for making the time. We have a huge number of people on this call, which is fantastic. Wonderful supporters, over 100 people, and I'm sure there are more people in houses with multiple people on the one call. It's amazing. Thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. We have a whole bunch of dignitaries, too many to name, I've been told. Simply too many fancy dignitary people for me to acknowledge individually. If you're a dignitary, I'm guessing you know who you are, and you're a dignified person. You don't need me telling you. Some names, some guy called Adam Bance here. I don't know who that is, but cool. It's great. If you want to say hello in the chat, you're very welcome to do so. Please say hello. We'd love to hear from you. Just in a little chat function there, that'd be great. Say hello. Keep it civil. You know, I know what you refugee legals people are like. You're wild. So say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're calling from. That'd be fantastic. It's going to be a great night. Hopefully, this is the last annual dinner we have to do digitally. But despite the circumstances, we're going to have a fantastic evening together. Tonight, we're going to celebrate and hear about all the amazing work that Refugee Legal has done over the past year. And we get to hear from our fantastic guest speaker, Nidal Nywan. Stoked to have her here, a fierce advocate for refugee rights, a fantastic Australian. We're very lucky to have her. And you'll have a chance to ask her a few questions as well a bit later on this evening. What else can I tell you? Oh, yes. Well, I was going to do some jokes at the top of the show. I organized about 20 minutes of Peter Dutton stuff. And then I ran that by the lawyers at Refugee Legal. And they had a few notes. And all I can say is that Peter Dutton is a man. I think that's all I'm legally allowed to say about that particular gentleman. And he's doing a fantastic job. So that's the comedy out of the way, which is great. Obviously, a lot has passed over the past. A lot has changed rather over the past 2 years as we've tried to make it through this pandemic. Our lives have been turned upside down, and we've had to ask ourselves a lot of questions and have another look at ourselves and our country. And we've got through it, kind of, with quite a few bumps along the way. We're still not quite out of the woods just yet. Unfortunately, though, some things haven't changed, and the thing that hasn't changed is the way that this country treats people seeking asylum. People who come to this country, refugees, some of the most vulnerable people in the world who just want a better life. Still, this country treats them appallingly, contravenes their human rights, demonizes them, and puts them into a system that can break people for a very long time and denies them their rights. And that is why I'm so thankful that Refugee Legal exists and other organizations like it to fight for refugees and people seeking asylum and doing the fantastic work that they're doing. It is ironic, again, I'm not the first person to point this out, but as there's been all these conversations about freedom and being locked up and being in quarantine and how difficult that has been for lots of people this year, people in this space who do this kind of work are fully aware that there are some folks in this country and as a result of this country's policies who certainly know a thing or two about having their freedom denied. And we can never forget that. You know, we've all been occupied with everything else over the past 2 years, but we can never forget the people who are languishing in detention now, the survivors, the ex-detainees, and this ongoing issue, this ongoing thorn in the side of Australia, the way we approach refugee rights. And again, I'm very thankful for this annual reminder and the constant reminders from Refugee Legal, all the emails, to let us know that people who work at this organisation are fighting for the rights of people seeking asylum. I was reminded of it this week. I got an Uber on Tuesday night, and I was making some volunteer calls for the Greens in the back seat because I'm a very cool guy. Shout outs to you, Adam. And Hetty was his name, I found out later, overheard my conversation, asked me if I was from the Greens. And I said, I'm a member and I volunteer. And he is an Australian citizen, and he's really excited to vote in his first election next year. Hetty came to Australia by boat. He escaped Taliban-controlled Pakistan in 2011, came to Australia by boat, saw a lot of people die on that journey, particularly on a boat to Indonesia, saw about 90 people from his village pass away, tragically. Made it to Australia, spent 7 months in detention in remote Western Australia, eventually made it out, is now an Australian citizen, is fighting through the process to get his family to come to Australia and be reunited. And he said that he's very excited about voting Greens at the next election. I know Refugee Legal's nonpartisan, that's important, but he was particularly impressed by Sarah Hanson-Young, who's been a fan of hers, and identified that party as one that really, really cared about refugee rights. And it was lovely to hear that story. And bizarrely, 7 months of detention is 7 months too long. But Hetty's example is one that's like not too bad in the grand scheme of things. And he's aware of that. He has friends who's been in immigration detention for 9 years. The conversation with Hetty was one of those frustrating, inspiring ones. It was really moved in the back of that Uber. And it was once again another powerful reminder of the situation of refugee rights in this country, and a very good reason to make sure that we never give up the fight. I'm going to crack on. Before I do, though, I just want to give really quick acknowledgement to activists. Obviously, Refugee Legal does fantastic, vital, and can I say long and boring admin work fighting for the rights of refugees, which is fantastic. But I am also constantly blown away by the bravery and the activism of people who go out there on the streets, who are protesting outside hotels and detention centers, who never give up that fight. I'm thinking of Refugee Action Collective and people like them. I just have a huge amount of love and respect for those people who actually get out there on the streets, even during a pandemic, in the best circumstances, who never give up that fight, and the recognition that people are still languishing in this really cruel system. So I want to give a shout out to them. Way better than the vax protesters, I would say. I prefer those protesters, that's for sure. Although I did see a great sign from an anti-vax protester recently. It was a man dressed as Darth Vader with a sign that said, "These vax mandates are full of so much science fiction, they belong in a galaxy far, far away." Which is kind of a cute sign until you remember that Darth Vader, a character quite famous for needing a mask in order to live. So not the brightest people sometimes. Anyway, thank you again for being here. Say hello in the chat. We've got a fantastic night ahead of us, and we really appreciate you taking the time on a Thursday night to join us for the Refugee Legal, Not the Annual Dinner 2021. I'll get that title right at one point during this evening. But now, to extend an informal welcome to everybody and kick tonight off, would you please give a very warm digital welcome to the Committee of Management Chair for Refugee Legal, Claire Morton. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good evening and welcome to you all to our online Not the Annual Dinner. And hopefully I can actually see you all next year in person at our old venue at the Fitzroy Town Hall, here's hoping. So I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all those elders joining us tonight. I'd particularly like to thank Tom Ballard for being our MC. I think it is the 5th year, and Tom, 5 years checks in the mail, you can be sure of that. And I also welcome Nodal Nguyen, who is our keynote speaker. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Nodal later this evening. This year, in the face of the COVID-19 upheaval, continuity of our services underpinned all we did. We continued to defend people's legal rights, educate the community, raise awareness of injustices and take action for change. We also continued to build partnerships and advocate at local and global levels for fair, just and humane policies. This work was epitomised by a response to the crisis in Afghanistan. As the crisis in Afghanistan unfolded, we quickly mobilised a legal team led by refugee lawyers, together with lawyers from a number of pro bono partnership law firms, to provide legal help for people at imminent risk of harm in Afghanistan and from people from Afghanistan in Australia seeking to remain in safety in Australia. With COVID-19 continuing to affect us all in extraordinary ways, so many asylum seekers, refugees, and vulnerable migrants have been at even greater risk and in desperate need of our help and protection. This crisis has compounded their vulnerabilities. The dangers have been even more acute for people detained. The Refugee Legal Pandemic Response Strategy continued to focus on continuity of legal services, protection of client rights, the safety, health, and well-being of clients, staff, volunteers, and other members of the community, and hone in core frontline services and operations. During this year, we have continued to focus on the well-being of our staff, and David Mann and the leadership team have worked hard to ensure all staff felt safe, supported, and were able to manage their client work. Importantly, during this year, all our critical core services, telephone advice, night service, our special legal clinics, full casework representation, and strategic litigation have been provided daily during the pandemic by our legal team working from their home offices, together with a growing ranks of volunteers across the country. In total, 9,080 clients have been assisted in 2021, which is a truly tremendous effort. Through our work, many people have been granted protection, freed from detention, evacuated to safety, better protected from family violence, or have had their residency restored. We simply could not have risen to these challenges without the partnerships and collaboration of a vast and growing network of over 550 volunteers, 18 pro bono corporate law firms, the Victorian Government, Victorian Legal Aid, leading law schools, UNHCR, and other international agencies, and our very generous philanthropic funders and individual donors. This support makes a direct impact and enables Refugee Legal to provide legal assistance and directly change people's lives. Ultimately, so much of our work has been powered by partnership and the will of the community for decency and justice. As the world moves to a post-pandemic recovery, together we are all well placed to respond to future challenges of escalating demand at critical levels for our essential legal services. Together, we will continue to make the biggest possible impact, knowing the powerful potential of our work to change the course of many people's lives immeasurably for the better. I sincerely thank David Mann for his tremendous work over another very challenging year. David's clear vision, expertise, and strong leadership, together with his support of his managers, the staff, and myself as chair, has ensured Refugee Legal has been in a strong position to confront a very changed environment. I also thank the leadership for their team for their support, both of David and the staff, and for the commitment and hard work they've shown over the past year. I thank the staff and our volunteers who form the backbone of Refugee Legal for their dedication, and I acknowledge their commitment and skill in assisting asylum seekers, refugees, and disadvantaged migrants. Finally, I'd like to thank my fellow board members for their work over this year, for their continued dedication to the defence of refugees and disadvantaged migrants' rights, and to the sustainability of Refugee Legal. And to you, thank you all for attending tonight and for your support. Enjoy the evening, and I'll now hand you back to Tom.
Thank you very much, Claire. Gosh, it's weird with no applause or anything, isn't it? Thank you, Claire. Thank you for your interest. Thank you very much for your work. Much obliged. I hope you're all having a wonderful, relaxed time and treating yourself to a delicious meal of some kind that you've prepared for yourself. Sorry, we didn't deliver you anything. Whether you're eating, a roast or KFC. I'm drinking a non-alcoholic beer because it's a Thursday. It's actually the eve of my 32nd birthday, which is a very boring date that no one cares about. Great stuff. Thank you, Claire. Of course, we'll always take your money here at Refugee Legal. Some of you have already been really, really generous in donating some cash in order to buy a ticket to tonight's proceedings, and we appreciate that very much indeed. If you were taken and swept up in the good news about Refugee Legal, and you want to chip in a little bit more, you're very welcome to do that. I believe in the chat now, some folks will be popping the donate link. If you're in a position to contribute some more money to support the fantastic work that Refugee Legal does, we would really appreciate that. I'll say that again later on in the evening when you're a bit drunker and more charitable. Now it is my honour and pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of Refugee Legal, Mr. David Mann. Over to you, David.
Well, thanks, Tom, and good evening and welcome, friends and fellow human rights seekers. And thanks, Tom, and happy birthday for tomorrow. Tom is a long-standing, not only MC, but Refugee Legal Ambassador, and thanks for being MC again tonight. Well, what a year it's been. For the second year running, it's not been possible to gather in person for the Refugee Legal Annual Dinner for obvious reasons, but we still wanted to continue the tradition. And like so many dimensions this year and last, to do it differently. But out of this has sprung some opportunities, and one of them is a wider guest list. And on that score, I just wanted to give a special welcome to some of the interstate and overseas guests that have joined us. This year has been dominated by the global pandemic, with the upheaval of COVID-19 affecting us all in extraordinary ways. So many people seeking protection and so many vulnerable migrants have been at even more dire risk and in need of our help. This crisis has continued to compound their vulnerabilities, and for people detained, the dangers have been even more acute. Trapped in COVID powder kegs, petrified. But with borders shut and lives in lockdown, global humanitarian crises knew no barriers. And these crises reverberated locally, here. Amidst the great upheavals, one thing remained constant for Refugee Legal. We continued to be called upon to respond to these crises by providing critical legal help to people in danger, in real danger, people in desperate need. So as we watched in horror the Taliban's lightning advance, seizing control across Afghanistan and converging on Kabul, distress calls to Refugee Legal, to the Refugee Legal phone line and by email escalated rapidly. And every day since, we've heard from people in Afghanistan and Australian Afghan community members of the fear and the distress and the dangers which grip the country. We're receiving distress calls from across Australia from people recounting harrowing stories of friends and family trapped in desperation and danger, and trying to find a way out to safety. They're asking us, how can we help people to evacuate to safety? And for Afghan people here on temporary visas, how can they secure enduring protection in Australia? The trauma reverberates deeply within communities here. And the demand for our help has been beyond overdrive. As this tragedy unfolded in mid-August, back in Melbourne, we mobilised resources overnight to assemble a special evacuation team led by Refugee Legal lawyers in partnership with lawyers from pro bono law firms, all at their home offices in lockdown, working around the clock, the team submitting applications, emergency applications for evacuation for hundreds of people in Afghanistan at imminent risk of persecution at the hands of the Taliban, and with the hope of getting them out to safety. The upshot, some people have been granted visas and brought to safety. Others have been granted visas but have not yet been able to find safe passage out of Afghanistan. And others are awaiting the outcome. We continue to plead the case for those left behind who remain in grave danger. You know, teachers, aid workers, female judges, human rights defenders, journalists, medicos. And in late August, responding to an emergency referral from a major aid agency in Australia, we helped Hashim and Seema and their 3 teenage daughters to apply for emergency evacuation to Australia. They went into hiding in Kabul as the Taliban militants searched door to door for people like them on their blacklist. They feared their aid work would see them brutally targeted and their daughters kidnapped, abused and subject to forced marriage. But with our help, they were granted emergency visas and then were able to find safe passage to evacuation. And not long after, we received another call from Hashim. This time, he was calling from Melbourne, together with Seema and his daughters, in safety, deeply relieved and deeply grateful for what we've done for them. As thousands of people called on us for help, we set up a new legal hotline and a new Afghanistan legal clinic to help others like Hashim and Seema and their daughters. And we stood in solidarity with the Australian Afghan community and sector partners in advocating for change, starting with the lift in what really is no more than an entry-level intake at the moment of 3,000, but calling for at least an additional 20,000 places for Afghans in danger. This was by no means, though, that was by no means the only crisis which called on us this year. In February, the brutal military coup in Myanmar sent shockwaves through communities here, resulted in many calls to us for urgent legal help from Myanmaris in Australia, and people petrified for their future. And in response, we established a special Myanmar legal clinic. And then in May, the government instigated a surge of interviews without notice and an arbitrary deadline for more than 1,000 people seeking protection who'd literally been left in limbo for more than 8 years without even an initial assessment of their case. In the face of this, we urgently mobilised once again a special legal team together with lawyers from many of our pro bono partners to help as many people as humanly possible in the face of this surge. Refugee legal is so often called upon to respond to the dire consequences of global events on the lives of so many people, and to do so in concrete ways which make a real difference to their future course. And as one of our pro bono lawyers recently put it about Afghanistan, and I quote, it's one thing to be watching this tragedy unfold on the nightly news. It's another thing altogether as a lawyer to actually be able to do something about it now, something that can change the course of someone's life for the better. Indefinite detention continues to epitomise the cruelty and extremity of immigration policy in this country. Right now, on the fringe of the Melbourne CBD, men remain imprisoned in the Park Hotel, a COVID incubator, with no end in sight after being evacuated to Australia for critical medical treatment after being held in PNG in Nauru for years on end. Recently, almost half of those men, 20 out of 46, contracted COVID, locked up. And still, this appalling human rights violation continues. We've also seen a continued escalation in requests from people, often refugees, detained indefinitely on character grounds, who face a double punishment resulting in indefinite deprivation of their liberty. We have a profound problem with liberty in this country. Detention policy continues to be punitive, to be arbitrary, unnecessary, and deeply harmful. It continues to harm people who have fled from harm, and often severely. It continues to represent one of the great injustices of our time, and to make perpetration of other injustices possible. So we, in partnership with others, are continuing to explore ways to challenge the detention of individuals to wrest back their freedom. Through our legal work, this year we have again been able to secure the release of some people from prolonged detention. We're also working with many others to build action for fundamental change so crucially needed in this area. This is the work we do, and it underscores the profound contribution that you and others continue to make, which enables us to do what we do. Tonight is a special opportunity not only to take stock of this year's work, but to also focus on the profound challenges that are immediately before us and the ones that lie ahead. And what's clear is that for people seeking our help and for those defending their rights, the challenges are only becoming more grave. But despite this, one thing is certain, one thing is constant, that we will continue to do all that we can to promote and to protect the rights of vulnerable people in need of our help. And with the hope and with the conviction that our work can change lives and the system. And then there's the other work that we do every day, and that is helping vulnerable people with predicaments which could hardly matter more, seeking protection from persecution and reuniting with family. Which brings me to another story of Samir, a 52-year-old man and his 2 nieces and 2 nephews, born in Iraq as stateless Faili Kurds. When Samir was a young boy, his family was expelled to Iran, where they lived under constant harassment and persecution without any basic rights or status, stateless. Samir fled in fear, arriving by boat in Australia in 2011, 10 years ago. His nieces and nephews arrived by boat soon afterwards. They were all granted protection as stateless Faili Kurds, and for the first time in their lives, the rights of permanent residence. In 2016, this is 5 years later, they applied for citizenship in the hope of finally attaining full rights and belonging. But instead, their citizenship application sparked a reopening of their refugee cases, and in 2019, their residence was cancelled on the basis that they were not, in fact, stateless. We took their case on appeal, but because they'd come by boat, they were stripped of basic rights. They were left with no visa, no rights to work, no income support, no access to Medicare, in fact, no access to any basic services at all. In effect, the cancellation rendered them stateless. Again, just recently, 3 years after, the tribunal overturned the cancellations, confirming Samir was stateless and restoring his permanent residency. The same decision followed for his nieces and nephews. And finally, after a lifelong battle, 10 years of it here, they have the right to have rights. It's another stark reminder that our legal work and staying the course so often makes a fundamental difference to the lives and the liberty of people in the face of terrible injustices. Across the country, beyond the current crises, unmet legal need for people seeking asylum, for refugees and vulnerable migrants remains endemic and escalating. Many asylum seekers, refugees and migrants have been suffering in the community on temporary visas or no visa at all, deliberately excluded from access to the most basic of supports, struggling to survive and at risk of destitution. For these women, these men, these children, these families, there is no financial safety net. And amidst a public health emergency, there has been no universal access to Medicare at all for many. No access to even basic medical care. As well, across the country, there continues to be a slow motion crisis for 31,000 people still in legal limbo, people who came by boat years ago. Some people are still awaiting the first decision on their refugee case after arriving by boat over 8 years ago. And those already granted temporary protection now having to replead their case for at best another 3 or 5 year visa, while facing indefinite, if not permanent, separation from family, stuck in danger overseas, the very dangers they fled from. Despite all of this and the challenges posed by the pandemic, refugee legal has not scaled back. Far from it. We've continued to work differently, maintaining all frontline services remotely. This means that all of our critical services, from telephone advice to night service, to our special clinics, to full casework representation, to strategic litigation, have been provided daily during the pandemic by our legal team, working from their homes, together with the growing ranks of volunteers across the country. So I'm delighted to again reiterate, as Claire did, that total client assistance for the year reached over 9,000 people, 9,080. We were able to do this powered by your support. Through our work, so many people have been granted protection, freed from detention, evacuated to safety, better protected from family violence, or have had their residency restored. Staff, volunteers and pro bono lawyers have done what they do best, provide expert legal help. Help which comes with a huge heart. The work has resulted in so many remarkable wins for clients, literally changing the course of their lives immeasurably for the better. As well, in partnership with other leading legal advocates, we've continued our strategic work for change by challenging unfair government decisions and systemic injustices. And in the last year, we've continued to secure the release of clients after years of indefinite detention. As the federal government sought to erode even more rights under the cover of the pandemic through the introduction of draconian laws, we advocated at Senate inquiries and through the media and many other channels to oppose these changes. And as Claire mentioned, we simply could not have risen to these challenges without the partnerships and the collaboration of our vast network, really a huge community, with the same will to ensure that people get a fair go before the law and that their dignity is upheld. I want to make a special mention here of another group that were involved in partnership this year, and that was major aid agencies who came together with us when the Taliban were converging on Kabul and worked with us day and night around the clock in partnership to ensure that we could provide that emergency legal assistance to people at high risk, at imminent risk in Afghanistan, many of whom had worked extensively on Australian funded or independently funded aid projects in Afghanistan in terms of reconstruction and empowerment of women and development of human rights in the country. People, because of their work, who were at and still are particularly significant risk of targeting by the Taliban. I also want to make special mention this year of the volunteers, including through our law firm partnerships, who stood up once again right across the country, from Brisbane to Perth to Melbourne, amidst multiple crises, and who have enabled us to expand the reach of our work once again, assisting people thousands of kilometres away under the supervision of our lawyers working from home. With Afghanistan and other crises, the surge in legal need has been matched by a surge in pro bono lawyers wanting to help. This has translated to hundreds of lawyers coming on board within days to assist on the front line in our work. The foundation for all of this work is the staff and the board. And once again, I must acknowledge the outstanding collegiality, the guidance and the support of the committee of management, and particularly the great leadership of our chair, Claire Morton. Finally, I have the immense privilege of working with a truly remarkable team of staff who go about their work tirelessly and with such skill, such passion, such commitment, and such humanity. You couldn't find a finer group. They are a remarkable group of people who have continued to do that work in extraordinary circumstances from their homes, but together as a team. So thank you. In closing, I want to return to partnerships and the question of change. In relation to change, we know advocacy campaigns can galvanise support. They can raise awareness of injustices and to challenge them. But real and enduring change is also so often achieved through providing direct legal help to individuals and as a consequence to their families, their communities, and our wider community, and through direct strategic legal action in the courts. It's also achieved through the profound connections made between people, whether it be corporate partners, corporate law firms, NGOs, students, other members of the community, wherever it occurs, right across our community. History shows that progress and change are not supernatural forces. They're determined by individual and political will, our individual and collective agency. So let's continue to work together with the hope and the conviction that we can effect real change by bending the destiny of so many people and of our country toward greater justice. That's why you and your support for Refugee Legal and those we assist is so vital, so valuable, and so powerful. As partners in our work, we deeply appreciate all that you do. You do make a real difference. Together, we can change the course of people's lives for the better, because what's at stake here is not only the lives of people seeking asylum, it's not only the lives of refugees, but it's also about creating the kind of society that we want to live in and defend.
Thank you, David. Once again, that deserves a big round of applause. Thank you very much for sharing those stories with us, celebrating the work that Refugee Legal does, and reminding us of how far we've got to go, but giving us hope that change can happen. Thank you, mate. I feel bad mentioning that it was my birthday tomorrow now, because after you talked about all that serious stuff, maybe it's not about me. Anyway, thank you, David, for all that you do. And we'll be hearing from David again very shortly. I'm about to introduce our keynote speaker, and then David's going to stick around for a Q&A with our keynote speaker and himself. And we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions, particularly as you listen to Nigel's address tonight, anything comes to mind, you can just hover your mouse down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A function there. Click on that and you can submit a question there. We'll do our best to put as many of them to our speakers as we possibly can. I don't know if this is illegal or what have you, but I did want to mention one small thing. Of course, Afghanistan has been a massive story this year. The humanitarian crisis there is extraordinary. And whenever I think of Afghanistan, I can't help but think of my friend Nasser Muradi, a Hazara dude who's been in detention for a very, very long time. I believe it's somewhere in the order of 7 years. Currently detained in Maida. A very gentle soul who's very funny and a pretty extraordinary man who taught himself to become an artist while he's been detained and produces artwork that is beautiful and heartbreaking. And he has an exhibition coming up very shortly. If you are in Melbourne, Nam, I've put the link in the show notes about his exhibition. The World Next Door is what it's called, a showcase of his work. I'm going to be there at the launch night on the 29th of November, off the top of my head. If you get a chance to come along, I highly recommend it. Nasser's pretty incredible, and we'd love to see you there. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker for this year's dinner. Nigel Nguyen is a lawyer, community advocate, writer, and very accomplished public speaker. She was born in a refugee camp in Itang, Ethiopia, and raised in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. In 2005, at the age of 18, she came to Australia as a refugee. Since then, she's been very busy. She completed a Bachelor of Arts from Victoria University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Melbourne. She has become a passionate and inspiring vocal advocate for human rights, multiculturalism, the settlement of people with refugee experiences, and those seeking asylum. She's worked and volunteered extensively in those areas with lots of different organisations. You've probably seen her pop up across the media, from The Drum to Q&A. She's a regular columnist for the 9 Fairfax papers and the Saturday paper. She's been awarded lots of things. In 2011 and 2014, she was nominated as one of the 100 most influential African Australians, an award that consistently ignores me in my work, which I find very insulting. In 2016, she was the recipient of the Future Justice Prize. In 2018, her efforts to combat racism were widely recognised with the Australian Human Rights Commission It Stops With Me award, in recognition of her advocacy and activism on behalf of the Australian, African, and Melbourne's South Sudanese communities. She's also received the Harmony Alliance Award for significant contribution to empowering migrant and refugee women, and was a co-winner of the Tim McCoy Prize for her advocacy on behalf of South Sudanese people in Australia. In June of this year, I'm sure lots of people on this call might have seen Nidal give an address to the National Press Club entitled Australia Reimagined. It was a fantastic address, and we are so lucky to have her with us tonight. Would you please give a very warm digital welcome to our keynote speaker, Nidal Nguyen.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Tom. I should mention, though, that my greatest accomplishment is having 2 children who always reminds you of how uninfluential you are when you try to get them to go to bed at the appropriate time. So I've got those humbling people at home to go back to. In terms of you not being recognized in the African awards, I will get in contact with them and tell them that you are an African of European appearance, or some sort, and that we should definitely be considering your great work, considering how much work you've been doing in this space in terms of advocacy around refugees and asylum seekers. In any case, if that doesn't get through, I'll adapt you as one of my younger South Sudanese brothers. I would like to, of course, start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'm going to read an acknowledgement of country that I gave at the National Press Club, because I think it's probably a thing that I had thought through a lot. But to be honest, it's probably because I've attended 7 meetings today, and it's probably much easier to go back to my previous organized notes and convince you all that I'm a very organized person in my daily life. So I would like to, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I am today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Since I work on these lands where they have practiced traditions and culture and raised children and worship and dream, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that they continue to maintain connection to their traditions and one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. I believe that to pause and truly acknowledge First Nation peoples and all that was brutally and violently taken from them is the first necessary step in reimagining what this country can be. And perhaps in a way, it reinforced to us the idea that how we treat others have a great impact and erosion on how we are treated eventually. I think if we are to set ourselves free from the past that continue to haunt Australian future, as exemplified by the vast gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, we will definitely have to resolve the question of reconciliation before we move on to the other questions about how we live with each other in a multicultural society, but also in a society that describes itself as a liberal democracy, yet have policies that detain people indefinitely. And so at the risk of sounding repetitive and annoying, but in the hope that acknowledgement of country never becomes a mere formality, but that it remains as a reminder of our ongoing business of nation building. And to me, as a migrant woman, a reminder of my place and where I stand in this nation colonial history. I repeat my acknowledgement of the traditional owners on the lands that all of us meet on today. I acknowledge their history of resistance. I acknowledge their continual survival, and I look forward to a country that is truly reconciled with its various many parts. Following the themes of today, not annual dinner, this is not a keynote speech. It's relatively going to be short, and I'm hoping to at least focus on three things. The first is embedded in my own personal story, and in a way of trying to explore why human rights matters to me. And then the second part is why human rights should matter to you, by exploring how the treatment and the othering of others has eroded principles that we have viewed as fundamental to liberal democracies like Australia. And then finally, drawing a little bit on the press club speech that I gave, I will talk a little bit about how we can encourage a culture of human rights within Australia through the reconceptualization of the concept of multicultural Australia. So to start off with, I suppose the personal journey. When I got admitted to Melbourne University in their JD program, I took a subject called human rights law out of interest. And one of the most startling phrases I heard was this idea that human rights are nonsense on stilts. And in some ways, I think it's a remark that reflects someone who has not had to rely on the concept of human right rhetorically, but also their practical implementation when they are the only thing left as a form of final defense. And perhaps strangely, the discovery of human rights by the anti-vaxxers and some of the demonstrators might persuade them, as hopeful as one can be, to understanding the usefulness of human rights as an important rhetorical frame, despite, I think, the weakness in a lot of the arguments that they raise. What, however, I think such movement recognizes is why human rights matters and how they give us a language to express what we think we're being denied. For me, I suppose human rights have always been there in one form or another, and they've never been, in a way, nonsense on stilts. I was born in refugee camps, and refugee camps, by definition, exists because of the international law structure that exists to be able to provide some sort of protection for people that are displaced. And these are the concepts that I suppose were developed in some form during the post-war era in terms of coming right with human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, among other instruments. So the food that was given to us on a fortnightly basis in the camps, that was based on donations from international organizations. The medication that we had, the school that I attended, the very refugee camps that I existed in, even with all its limitations, existed because somebody somewhere believed in the concept of human rights and was able to provide some practical assistance to those refugees that were displaced. I came to Australia in 2005. That makes it almost 16 years since my arrival here. And when I arrived here on our visa, the entry visa that you receive as you come to Australia, in the place of what required, inquired what country we belong, were the word stateless. Because South Sudan had been in a conflict for a long time, and because my family had been displaced at least twice by conflict, we had been refugees or displaced people for so long that we were technically considered stateless people. And in a way, the first country that I've ever had any formal citizenship of is Australia. I got my Australian passport shortly after my 20th birthday, I think, and went for a visit to South Sudan. On my return from that journey, I landed in Melbourne Tullamarine Airport and gave my Australian passport to the immigration officer at the, standing there to inspect it. And she inspected the passport, and I've told this story a number of times, and gave it back to me, and she said, welcome home. And it felt like home. It is one of those moments that today I recall what it is to be afforded the rights and the privileges to citizenship and the protection of a country, or in David Mayne's words, what it is to have rights to rights. And in some ways, I am tremendously grateful of the opportunities that this country has given someone who was a former refugee and is now a citizen. The ability to live in a safe environment, the ability to have, in a way, see a transformative intergenerational difference between my mother and I, merely because of the opportunity to have been settled here at a relatively younger age, and as a result be able to truly take the benefit of the education systems and all the other opportunities that exist in a country like Australia. So I tend to look at those things that are positive as how this country has embraced me. But I think that my story, and obviously we know of many other stories, is merely the tip of the iceberg of what refugees, given just a small window of opportunity, are able to turn that into a lifetime of achievements. And I'm often, I think, part of why I am personally passionate about refugees and people who seek asylum is because I know their inherent humanity, because it was also mine at some point. I understand that for the two little girls that we saw screaming as they were being deported with their family on a plane are two young girls with potential dreams and possibly all the abilities that any of us that have children today and will go home to hug them and to kiss them tonight knows that those girls have the same potential. And so that's why I am personally committed to human rights, because of what they are able to provide us if they're truly protected and we are allowed access to those rights. But obviously, integrating or coming to a country is not only a positive story. And in the many ways that I've been embraced by this country, there have been many ways in which I have been rejected by it, particularly the experiences of racism. I think the continual political and economic currency that race continue to place in our society has definitely left huge dent in my perception of what kind of Australia or Australian I am. And I have admitted, without wanting to do so, sometimes how there are times that I have thought of leaving this country, or wondered about the ability of my children to grow up with their full self-esteem intact if it keeps being assaulted by racist media, racist political narrative, and conversations that continue to dehumanize them because of the color of their skin. So in a way, it's not surprising then that I am interested in human rights and that I am interested in the idea of what it is like to live in a country and have access to rights and privileges that many of us are afforded in one form of another. But I think the next stage is, why should you be interested in human rights? And we know the obvious reasons. I suppose the the charitable reasons for why you'd want to be interested in human rights. But I think there is a far more fundamental reason why a commitment to human rights is important. And to borrow a kind of a framing from Chimamanda Adichie, who is a writer, an amazing writer from Nigeria, on this concept of why we should all be feminist, I think we should all be human rights activists, because the protection of the rights of those in the margin determine how comfortable those in the mainstream continue to enjoy the rights and the privileges they currently have. My mother used to tell me a saying whenever she thought I was treating someone differently. And she would say, discrimination always starts far, but ends at home. I want to talk about two examples that I think demonstrate why the treatment of those in the margins impacts our rights as impacts the rights of those in the mainstream, or those who deem themselves or think to deem themselves as only participating in the conversation of human rights for the protection of others, but not themselves. The first, I think, is the war on terror. And the second is something that is far more close to home, and that is the African gang narrative. I think that the war on terror has permanently transformed Western democracy in a far more fundamental and insidious way than most of us are probably aware of. I wrote a response to a quarterly essay on this idea of strongmen, which is normally sold as something that tends to happen in African countries. And I wanted to draw on that and read a little bit from that piece on what and on the idea of how Western democracies have been transformed by the war on terror, especially in relation to the foreign policies that have been adopted. In my view, one way in which this has occurred is by gradually eroding beliefs in the importance and the indispensability of principles and norms that were once held to be fundamental to how society saw itself. For example, the Patriot Act in the United States, that was introduced in some ways really to deal on the war on terror, has been used by the FBI far more domestically than it's been used to supervise those from the outside. We have seen also in places like Australia debates about citizenship, and in fact going as far as the idea of being able to revoke people's citizenship. To me, this seems like almost a rather extreme reaction that start off by people that makes it easy to identify as the enemy or the other, but much more harder in conversations that require some level of nuance. For example, the deportation powers have been used to deport young people of African background or to revoke their visa for crimes that a young person of white appearance would not have been treated in such a way. So I think in a way, fundamental principles like, to be presumed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, how these kind of principles that were so important to the law, but also to the way Western democracies saw themselves, were so easily dismissed when it came to this idea of fighting a war on terror, where people were in fact presumed to be guilty because of their appearances or their religious affiliation. And in fact, we've seen examples in Australia where, because of very tenuous evidence, people have ended up in jail. And of course, this attitude, I think this attitude of discriminating far, seeping into our own national consciousness and eroding our sense of what rights should be protected for all, is not something that is necessarily new, particularly for those who have always been in the minority. Frederick Douglass, who was an anti-slavery campaigner, mentioned something in its speech that I thought was really useful to talk about here today. And in his speech, he says that slavery at the time not only destroyed the moral power of America abroad, it corrupts politicians at home. And I wondered to what extent that statement is true in how we have been corrupted by what governments and politicians have allowed to happen to others because of how they arrived in this country. I think, without sounding dramatic, I think it's truly a nation that has been corrupted morally in some form to have witnessed what was done to 2 little girls born in this country, being deported and detained. You have to ask yourself, what happens to a country that thinks, allows that to happen? And how would we have felt if those were our children? So I think, the other way in which minorities or the persecutions of minorities eventually impacts those in the mainstream is a far more recent story. The second example that I was talking about the African gang narrative. Initially, it started as identifying people of African appearance, whatever that meant. I was not sure whether, if, say, for example, Tom was a white South African, whether he would technically be considered a person of African appearance, or whether really the media wanted to say Black, but they didn't feel comfortable enough to say Black, perhaps because they would be easily labeled as maybe playing into racist politics. But the African gang narrative has mostly disappeared now in the media, and I don't want to be taken as undermining the impact that criminal acts committed by people of African descent would have had on victims. What I want to draw out of that conversation is what has occurred since then, because of the conversation that there was this crisis of criminal offending and that Victorians were threatened by it. There was also an equal reaction politically to be seen as doing something. There was the potential introductions of laws that would stop young people from hanging together. It's the kind of laws that were introduced to deal with bikie gangs, and that had some problematic implementation. But what has been left behind is sort of the residue of the gang pandemic, is that Victoria now is one of the most over-policed places in Australia, partly because of the need to react as opposed to COVID-19, but definitely the need for government to be seen as wanting to be seen to be doing something. And I think that should make all of us who care about civil liberties, about what that means when we are funding, and I have to be careful how I say this, when our funding for police and security apparatus are increasingly growing, despite the fact of homelessness and other social economic issues that contributes to crime, are not having the same kind of attention. So in those two stories, all I am saying is that human rights is about you, not because you care, not because you have a charitable view about the world, which I highly welcome, but because it is the protection of the people in the margin that reflects on how those who are powerful or those who feel protected would eventually be treated. In a way, your commitment to human rights of others is the equivalent of, if you watch Game of Thrones, holding the door. You are the holder, the character holder that essentially holds the door so he can allow, I suppose, the hero of the story to escape. Finally, I want to talk about how we can try and entrench a culture of human rights, and I want to explore that through the common understanding we have about Australia as a multicultural society. I want to read a little bit from the speech I gave about Australian multiculturalism. And in particular, I want to talk about the kind of attitude that I think need to shift in our discourse about multiculturalism in order for that concept to not be something that mainstream Australians give to others, but embedding this new understanding of equality among Australian citizens. Now, if I can just find where my notes are, I would consider this speech a success. Oh, I found it. I want to read a little bit from the extract of the speech. Australian multiculturalism is still confined within the power structures in which it was forged. It still remains as one group inviting another, often the less powerful, to participate in the nation's life. It is not a relationship of equals or of a common endeavor. And our institutions in the various levels continue to reflect these power differences. The main problem in my view of Australian multiculturalism is the power structures that exist in the original concept do not reflect the current population. And also the other important fact is that I think it shapes and limits our thinking. They shaped fundamentally our attitudes towards each other. The prevailing attitudes that Australian citizenship is a gift bestowed on immigrants for which they should be profoundly and forever grateful, and acts to qualify and even contradict migrants' full sense of Australian citizenship and of belonging. As an immigrant, I'm grateful to Australia, but gratefulness is not a basis on which we can build an equal society based on mutual respect. Such attitudes suggest that there are two kinds of Australians, those who come earlier and those who come later, and that the first group built this place and the second came along and reaped the benefit. So why do I want to draw on the attitudes that we bring to multiculturalism? Because the theme of my speech really is about the thread of humanity that ties through all of us. In a way, I'm trying to structure conversations about human rights, conversations about multiculturalism, not from a top-down approach in which we give others, but in the way that they relate to the quality of life that we get to live, and eventually that we leave behind as a legacy for other generations to inherit. Sorry, someone just came to the room. And I think that that's a really important shift, an attitude shift, because it really tells how we get to treat each other. When we look at the treatment of women, when we look at the treatment of minorities, that's the relationship between us as citizens. These are relationships that to some degree are defined by power and the way we use power. And I think that's also the same thing about human rights generally. What I wish to leave all of you with is to treat these larger concepts that touch on some ways on the issue of human rights and to an extent on equality, not as a conversation that you have with others, not as your charitable gift to the world, but really how they link you and your humanity to others, and why it is to some degree both a personal fight as much as it is a fight for those at the margin. I hope my speech today makes some sense. This is where I will stop.
Oh, Nigel, thank you so much. It made total sense. And that was a beautiful address. Thank you very much for sharing both your personal story and that personal challenge, and challenging us all to be Hordors. What a beautiful message. For people who haven't seen Game of Thrones, it makes no sense whatsoever, but I got it and I loved it. So thank you so much. Please stay with us. David Mann, Executive Director at Refugee Legal, will join us as well. And I'm lucky enough to be able to throw a few questions your way and have a bit of a chat together at this beautiful dinner that we're sharing tonight. If you have a question, you can submit it on the Q&A function. You'll see just the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'd love to hear any questions whatsoever from you for Nigel or David about anything you like. Thank you very much for the love in the chat too, everybody. If you'd like to show your appreciation to Nigel at the chat, you're very welcome to do so as well. What I have one quick question for Nigel I'd like to start with. You mentioned the grateful refugee trope. It's something that we really do seem to hear a lot, and it seems to indicate a fundamental misunderstanding of what human rights are, as you sort of mentioned in your speech as well. Could you give us some examples of what it's actually like to experience that and have those kind of attitudes directed your way? What it's like living as someone in this country when that is a prevailing perception from a lot of people that you don't deserve safety and dignity, that we're doing you a favor here by letting you into this country.
I think it's very much related to who we think is entitled to what. And I think in the context of Australian citizenship, who we think are Australian and who are who are sort of secondary Australians. And it does have, I mean, beside it being sort of more a conversational issue in terms of offense, I think it does have real policy, government policy impacts. And a good example was the Indian ban, right? Despite the fact that we had a very contagious COVID strain in the UK, and I think per capita there were probably much more infection in the UK than in India. We had a much more drastic reaction to Australian citizens of Indian descent than we could even conceive when it came to Australian citizens, of British descent or of British connection. And I think that we could even conceive, because it was not even in the spectrum of conversation or possible reactions. But when it came to Australian citizens of Indian descent, the government literally introduced a ban against citizens not only coming to this country, but impose potential penalty that included being in jail for returning to your own country. And that can only be justified at some level by an assumption that you are this kind of secondary citizen whose citizenship is not an entitlement, is a gift, that can sort of, a conditional gift, in fact, that can sort of be revoked based on your performance or government perception of your risk as a person to the country. And it's sort of, you see it in the conversation about anti-terrorism legislations, where there is definitely a conversation to be had about national security, but where the revocation of people's citizenship who have some engagement of some connection to what has been defined as terror-related activities. And in some cases, it's possibly clear why that decision has been made. And in some cases, I am not sure that it is clear. An example is the young women, some of the young girls, I think they were 16 or 17, that got married to ISIS men, and those ISIS men or young men who were then killed, and then now being refused any consideration of being brought back to Australia or being offered, their citizenship being cancelled and not being treated as citizens at all. And whatever sound argument exists, it's inescapable to think about these young girls as also victims in some form, like victims of either grooming or victims. And I think the narrative, in my view, I think the conversation would be very, very different if those young girls were white, blonde, blue eyes young girls. I think the conversation would be different. And perhaps that's, that's something that I can cop criticism about. But I think that's another example in which that kind of conditional citizenship begin to emerge because of who is deemed to be worthy of absolute protection by the citizenship. In terms of, I think, my personal interaction with it, the main ways I've experienced it is anytime I criticize a position, whether it's government position, I'm told to go back where I come from if I don't like it. And I think that's something that definitely is like a citizenship with an asterisk, right? In a way, it's like you are a citizen, but you can only praise this country. And if you don't praise this country, then you should go back to where you come from because it's technically worse anyway, which either suggests that I am not a citizen, first of all, because citizenship would mean both the rights and the privileges, but also the full right to engage in public conversation. But what's also interesting to me is not only is that deemed as not as me not being grateful, it's also how, to me, I think sometimes is being put in this position where I have to perform gratefulness in order to convince people of their own generosity and charity. So if Australia thinks of itself as an egalitarian society that gives rights and privileges, I shouldn't have conversation about mandatory detention because that's bad, but I should perform gratefulness so that I can reaffirm the image that Australia has of itself, even if there's some identifiable failure. And then finally, I think the other gap that shows, I suppose, the different treatment is that my sort of let's say engagement in public discourse is framed as a hate of the country, or potential hate of a country, or whereas, you know, if someone, say, in the conservative media criticize aspect of Australian policies because they love this country, they care about this country, they want to make it better. So there's a class of citizens whose criticism of Australia is seen as a patriotic act of caring, and a class of citizens that can only engage in a discourse of gratefulness, or otherwise they are not, they don't love the country enough.
Gosh, well said. And, you know, sorry about all that. Sorry about this.
Sorry, I hope I'm making sense. Oh yeah, thanks.
No, you're making total sense. I'm just embarrassed by the country. But thank you, I appreciate it. All right, we are getting close to the time when we're going to be sort of wrapping up things. But I really want to put some of these questions to you. You're both very good at talking. I'm going to ask you to keep it succinct as much as you possibly can. I'd really appreciate that, just so we can cover as many questions as we possibly can. Someone has asked, in your opinion, I'll put this to you, David, which areas of refugee and immigration law do you see operating to create the greatest injustices, and in turn having the most dire consequences on individuals and the biggest adverse impacts on communities? If you could click your fingers, David, fix one thing, get rid of one particular law, what jumps out at you as the biggest drain and problem in this area?
Yeah, it all starts with indefinite detention, in my view. In fact, I've come to think over the years that the indefinite detention, not only the policy but the practice, which has been implemented with extreme force over the years, is at the very heart of the overarching problem. And if I could put it like this, if we can as a country come to a point which we have reached a point where it becomes normalized to lock up innocent people for prolonged periods, children, women, men, families, for now decades, and the nation has hardly flinched, really. People who have fled from terrible human rights crimes, who've not been charged, tried, or convicted in relation to the detention at all. I think that what can happen, and I think, Nigel, you really pointed to this, what can happen, and you use the term corruption, it can corrupt, it can involve over time a sort of a corruption of the soul of the country, I think. And I think, if I could put it like this, if the nation can become inured to one of the most serious of all deprivations of liberty, without end, it opens up a really sinister path to other possibilities. And really, to me, it opens up the path to Nauru, to Manus Island, because they become possible, because you can do this to people. And that's why I mentioned in the speech before, literally just up the road from where I am, just a number of kilometres up the road, it's happening now. That the government have sort of subcontracted a hotel to imprison people effectively in what's called immigration detention, but it's effectively a form of imprisonment. for people who've never been charged, tried or convicted of anything. In fact, they were brought back because they were so unwell that they'd been so deeply, cruelly harmed on Nauru and Manus Island for years on end. They were brought back for medical treatment that couldn't be provided there, only to be then consigned to more of the same inhumanity. The kind of humanity from which many of them fled. So that's, to me, at the heart of it.
Someone else has asked about the spike in the number of visa cancellations on character grounds in recent years. Is that a growing problem that you're seeing?
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it, because effectively what's happened is that after someone who, and some people who've been locked up indefinitely on character grounds, on the basis of character grounds, some of those people have committed offences resulting in the cancellation, but courts in this country have already dealt with those matters, and so has the criminal justice system. But after that, where anyone else in this country would be released on parole, instead, after they've served any sentence, without a crack of light, they're transferred not into the community, but straight into indefinite detention, not incarceration with any knowledge of a limit on the time, not with a sentence where you know how long you're going to be locked up, but for a further form of incarceration where you have without end. Not only without end, but without any further charge, without any further trial, without any further conviction, at the whim of the government of the day. And frankly, at the whim of one person in the country, the Minister for Immigration at the time. So really a political judgment about the person's freedom. And to me, that is one of the great injustices of our times.
Okay,
and can I add to that? I do want to acknowledge, Tom, I know we've got to be short on this and I haven't been, but I'm sorry. But the mighty work of my colleagues at Refugee Legal, who have done a lot of heavy lifting in that area of people locked up in those kinds of circumstances, and continue to, while exploring avenues for change. But it is a really, and in terms of unmet legal need, it's one of a number of really particularly dire issues in this country.
All right, I'm just going to go for two more questions. One for you each. Nigel, we've discussed the problems and the implications of speaking up as a person of color, of a refugee background or migrant background in this country. You've been the recipient of some horrific feedback over your time as an outspoken advocate for human rights. You've called that out very admirably, and you haven't shut up. So thank you very much for doing that. I suppose I'm just interested in whether, you find it is the experience of people of color from these migrant communities, refugee-led advocacy, people with lived experience, whether they feel they are in a position to advocate for this stuff publicly. Who are the advocates that jump out at you that are really making a difference and cutting through, and how can we push those voices closer to the front and empower them to really advocate for themselves and for other people in their position? The phrase "nothing about us without us," right? How can we do that as people who might be filled with the privilege of citizenship, of a certain skin color, and of material comfort? How can we do that?
You're on mute.
Oh, you're on mute, Nigel.
The theme of 2021 and 2022, you're on mute. I think you're doing it in some way, Tom, by lending your skills, your expertise to organizations that do this work. I think another way to do it is amplifying those voices in the media and in social media. If you see them getting attacked online, kind of being there, just sending a message of support is always useful. Put your money where your mouth is. I think that's another thing. Donate if you cannot demonstrate or you cannot go to a rally, and whatever in your life that you do well, try and incorporate some form of it. If you're a lawyer, I know there's a lot of lawyers who do like pro bono work on this area. do that, mentor young people from those communities so that they can become advocates in their own rights. And for me, I think that everybody has a voice. I don't believe in the concept of voiceless. I think I can't pronounce the name, but there's a writer who talks about the preferably unheard. Most people are in the category of being preferably unheard. They have voice, they have stories, they know what is impacting them, but we prefer not to hear them because of what their message say about us, for example, about the failures in our own communities, and the discomfort that brings. And then most importantly, have the courage to continue engaging in difficult and uncomfortable conversations.
Great, thank you, Nigel. Finally, David, I know Refugee Legal is nonpartisan. That's important. There is an election next year. In your view, if the government were to change, hypothetically, is there reason for hope there? Could we imagine a better Australia if this particular government, with their certain policies and their orientation to this issue, to refugee rights and migration generally, do you see much hope there? And can we put much store in electoral politics, making some wins and some improvements here?
Yeah, I actually come at it from a slightly different angle, and it's not. I understand the question in terms of if there was a change of government that would provide the greatest hope for change, but I think I would reframe that a little bit and say, whoever gets government in the future, what are the prospects for change? I think we have to work in that way, and I always think change is inevitable. It's just what it's going to look like. I don't think things are ever stuck, and there are lots of conversations going on behind the scenes about change at a range of different levels, and some of them are predictable and some of them surprising, because some of the policies really, these cruel and inhumane policies, they have a tendency to turn in on themselves. And so I think that the bigger question is, what does need to change, and then of course what's the are either of the major part, or is the government or the opposition interested in changing? TPVs is one issue, the temporary protection. That policy is literally, it is tied to electoral cycles if you look at it historically. It's what I've come to call a temporary election visa, because it can change. I mean, the Labor opposition at the moment, to the extent that, well, I don't think they're saying anything at the moment, but about anything really. Certainly they have no position on doesn't appear to be that they've got a position at all, even on the Afghan intake, but they have in the past abolished temporary protection when they've got into government. They've in their national platform, that's what they've said they'll do. So that could be one area of change, and I think that is one of the starting points in terms of change, is to respond to reform in that area, to respond to the plight of people. 31,000 people who are literally living re-traumatized in a twilight world in this country. I think it's really difficult to predict, whether there will be by either side any appetite for major change. I always think it's possible, and sometimes unpredictable. But beyond that, I think that neither side have really committed to any fundamental reform. I don't think, it's not apparent, but I don't think at the moment we're going to see much of that in the lead up to an election. Of course, we're not going to see any commitment to fundamental reform, I don't think, in these kinds of areas. The question is, what, in laying those foundations for change, which we're working on together with others every day, what are the possibilities? Not only about reform that can mitigate in the immediate the harm that continues to be caused on a widespread scale, but also what are the opportunities for fundamental change in the future, and not just naming problems, but challenges, but solutions, coming up with solutions. So, it's a broad answer to a complex issue, and I don't think in the lead up we're going to get much of an idea, but I think that there's always potential.
Fingers crossed. Well said. Thank you, David. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you very much for people who submitted questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to you. I'm just conscious of people's times. It's amazing that everyone on this call has pretty much stuck around for the entire time. We really appreciate that. We are about to finish things up. To give us a formal vote of thanks tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce a refugee legal senior lawyer, Sophie de Rohan. Over to you, Sophie.
Hi, everyone. Nigel, you can put your video back on so we can see you, so that I can Thank you properly. Thank you for your inspiring words and for the work that you do. As you were speaking, I was reflecting on the many layers in which racism is entrenched in our legal system in Australia, and the impact that this has on the people that we work with and whose stories we bear witness to every day. And I think that's something that we are trying to be conscious of and trying to work against as we work in this very difficult system. But I guess on a more, I don't know, hopeful note, I was also reflecting on the privileges conferred on those of us who were born in this country and the responsibility that comes with this privilege. The privilege to bear witness to the stories and experiences of our First Nations people, and to those who have come from afar and seek our help and who seek safety in this country. And I think this is why we at Refugee Legal do the work that we do. And I think this is what drives us as well. And I hope that we can continue to utilise our privilege to work together towards a just society that protects and ultimately supports and gives voice to those who are more vulnerable than us so that they can flourish in this country. Nidal, you are a true example of strongly felt and action values, and Australia is very fortunate to have you as a citizen of this country. We thank you for your leadership and the invaluable work you do towards a just and fair society. Your voice is a very powerful antidote to the white patriarchal system that we live and work in. And I agree, we should all be human rights activists and we should all be feminists. So thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Hear, hear. Brilliantly said. Thank you, Nidal. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody in the world, for joining us tonight for this, the 2021, not the annual dinner for Refugee Legal. Hopefully the last one we have to do are cooped up in our little houses. Hopefully to see you in person next year, though I do appreciate that some people are able to join us tonight because we're online, which is fantastic, and we welcome you and thank you very much for your time. I'm going to give another plug to Refugee Legal to give them some money. If you've been moved and touched by tonight's proceedings, you know how fantastic the work that Refugee Legal does. You know how vital it is. If you're in a position to chip in, then please do so. Just go to the Refugee Legal website and go to the donate page. That would be fantastic. David, did you want to say anything to wrap us up, or are we pretty good to say goodnight?
No, I just want to finish by, there's been a lot of thank yous, but I just wanted to thank you, Tom, because you have been an extraordinary supporter of ours over the years, and so many others too. And I think also have such a deep connection. And I know you've had a huge involvement, not only in the sector and in the issues, but also at a personal level, and you know, have befriended people and kept in touch with people and taken an active interest in, you know, people who are subject to these policies. And I just want to thank you, and thank you for your friendship and to all of us in the organisation. And happy birthday tomorrow.
Oh my gosh. Okay, now I'm blushing. Nidal, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being our keynote speaker tonight. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us for tonight's webinar. We will see you next year in person. Stay safe, and thanks again for your time.